Welcome everyone to this week's edition of Bombercast for 2023, the post West Coast Eagles win edition. I'm your regular co-host, The Grizz, and joining me today is two other posters on the board, which is fantastic. We've got regular co-host Bonser back for this week. How are you, Bons?
Yeah, good. I'm not sure how much of a regular co-host you can call me this year, but I'm back and I'm not infected with a disease like I have been most weeks this year.
That's right. It's that time of year, isn't it? Sickness is just hitting everywhere. And a man who might as well be a regular co-host of this podcast. He's basically a regular. We love having him on. He's also the co-host of his own podcast, Don the Stat, which comes out every Thursday afternoon, I think, every Thursday night. And he's also the podcaster of creator of Endless Summers, Test Cricket History of Australia. Kip Tastic, how are you, mate?
I'm good, mate. Thanks for that great introduction. It's great to be back at the place that started it all. I think coming on a couple of times a year just sort of brings me back to where it all started. So thanks for having me back.
It's always a pleasure to have you. It's always a pleasure to have people and guests on after a win, which was what we had on the weekend. The first time we've beaten West Coast in Perth for a while. They tend to have a number over there. The Bombers 14-12-96 beat the West Coast Eagles 6-10-46. Probably not a game you're going to write home about in terms of its quality or watchability, but any 50-point win over the Eagles in Perth is a good one for me. Bont, we'll start with you. And my general question is, considering the quality of the opposition and the way it was played, what exactly can we take away from that game?
Well, it's interesting because, it wasn't a great game to watch, I suppose, although I certainly enjoyed it because, 50-point wins were always nice, but I still think we take a fair bit out of it, to be honest. If you think about it, West Coast got belted last week, so the media was all over them. They had a few players come back, which, also it leads to the experience. They were a little bit more battle weary or battle hardened, I suppose is the better term, than they were against Hawthorn, obviously. Over in Perth, regardless of where they are, they're always a bit of a different kettle of fish to when they have to travel. I look at that and go, Essendon in the last decade probably drops that. It was the game that was set up perfectly for us to lose, and we won every quarter. It was very workmanlike performance, and as a result, I think I probably take more out of it than most. But as you said, 50-point wins always nice, and it just improves our record in Perth, which probably hasn't been great.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's been a lot of commentary amongst the fan community after the game that just sort of move on, but a few things really stuck out to me about how we went about it. As you said, Bonser, West Coast had a lot more of their experienced players back in, and actually came in with a pretty decent plan to try and restrict our game. And playing that man-on-man defense meant it was very difficult to find loose players to move the ball on quickly, which is often how we want to move the ball from the back half. But what was really pleasing for me was that, given that that's what West Coast were trying to do, we adjusted. I think a lot of people say, going in, this is the sort of game Essendon would have dropped. I don't necessarily think we would have dropped that game, but I think if we were just trying to play our way, as the past couple of coaches have tried to do, we might have eked out a 10-point win at best. What really pleased me was we were really focused, really disciplined. We were prepared to move the ball slowly, find breaks in the West Coast defense, and just the quality of our players meant that, as you said, we won every quarter. We won each quarter by at least 2 goals. And when you do that across 4 quarters, you end up with a 50-point win. And as we sort of say, you take that in Perth every day. I think the thing I most take out of that is it gives a really positive view of what the mindset of the players are in games like this, that they've gone over, they've done the job, they've adjusted and being prepared to play in a different way than they want to play in order to get the job done. So that gives me a lot of confidence moving forward that they're going to continue in that frame of mind.
It's an interesting one because we got the jump early, I think, because we were winning the clearances. And like you said, Kip, when you're playing a heavy man-on-man defense, which the Eagles were, if you're getting pumped in the clearances, I think we were 14-4 up or something in that stat late in the third quarter, early in the second quarter, sorry. You can tend to catch defenders out, which is good. But I think once they went man-on-man, our ability to move the ball around, the high uncontested marking game, I think both teams were 32 more uncontested marks on the night than they were for the season average, which probably indicates the style of the game. Both teams were just trying to avoid turnover as much as they could, and both teams were under their sort of their total turnovers were less than the average for the season. So it just shows both teams were trying to avoid damage, but quality took over in the end. One thing I really liked from the game, and it sort of come out over the course of the week, how good this guy is Nick Martin. So I thought he was a leading disposal getter. His ability to get those uncontested marks and use the ball through the middle of the field as a link-up man was really important. So he's not your conventional winger like Melbourne use theirs, where they just hold width all the time. He does come inboard and create options through the middle of the field, which I think is really helpful. I think Champion Data had him as the number one ranked wingman in the competition, according to their statistics this year. And, you can argue about how Champion Data calculate that. But it just goes to show that the guy that Bonta and I were nicknaming Crichton last year, it turns out might be one of the best value pickups I can think of the last, at least 5 to 6 years, Kit.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a really good thing about how willing he is to look inboard. And that really complements our game style, where we're trying to control the corridor as much as possible, both on defense, and then be able to turn that around on to make it an offensive weapon. It's having a player like him with such good foot skills and such good vision means that he can pick apart those zone defenses that the teams are trying to set up when we get the ball on turnover. And, just building on that, we've ended up now with quite a few good users through that middle of the ground. So you mentioned Martin, obviously Merritt, and then Perkins getting up from half forward and being that really precise kick that puts players into dangerous positions. So we've got quite a few weapons by foot now that can really do a lot of damage. And as you say, Martin is one of those. I think there's still a lot of development in him. I see a potential for someone who could go inside. It was mentioned somewhere else, and it forgot exactly where I heard this, but someone compared him to Jordan Dawson at Adelaide, what he's been able to do since going into the middle. And I agree with the person who said that's a potential for him going forward.
I think the other pretty pleasing thing about Martin is he was actually pretty good against Richmond as well. So it's not like it's just a sort of jack out of the box performance. And something you sort of take from a Martin is that, and Jai Caldwell did it last week, when you have these blokes like Shield and Parrish on sitting out, you get these blokes like Martin and Caldwell who are able to have, career highs and touches because they're actually able to get more around the ball and they're actually able to use it more. So it sort of exposes them, and it just means that, we start building that depth so that, when they do come back, if Shield or Parrish or even, Merritt on a wing doesn't fire, we've still got blokes that we can actually just throw in there into the coalface and actually be more confident that they're going to be able to step up and cover any down games those guys have.
And Bont, what other sort of positives did you take out of the match outside of, of what we've just talked about?
Yeah, so the one that stood out for me was I was pretty pleased with how we were with ball in hand in our back 50. So if you look at the Richmond game the week before, Jai Caldwell had that left foot snap that went sort of 20 metres on the ground and got kicked straight back over his head. McGrath had the handball in the goal square, which missed the target, and Rioli slammed it through. And then, Hind tried to switch to McGrath, and Jack Riewoldt spoiled it, and Richmond again got another goal in there. You look at that and go, well, three direct turnovers in our back 50, gave up 3 goals against Richmond. And West Coast, as you said earlier, Grizz, we're playing sort of, or it might have been you, Kip, so we're playing that man-on-man sort of football. So it was a little bit different in terms of pressure, but it's still good, I think, to see that something that we really struggled with against Richmond, we then, I think, worked on probably during the week. I reckon Brad Scott would have said something about it. And as a result, the players looked a little bit more composed. They just seemed to take that extra heartbeat to really work out what their options were, as opposed to the week before when we got it deep, we were sort of panicking and just thumping it out of there or trying to thump it out of there. And, when you're playing at AFL level, you can't just thump the ball, especially poor old Jai Caldwell, whose left foot's not great. He gets onto that. I mean, the thing was, he had time with that kick. I watched it again not recently. He had time to swing on his right, and he actually had another moment deep in our back line on Saturday night where he almost went to pull the trigger on the left and went, oh, actually, I've got some time here, and then swung back onto the right and cleared it away. So, stuff like that I think is really good to see week to week, that if we make those errors against Richmond, well, then the next week we've cleaned it up, and as a result, it looks much better, albeit against the 18th best team in the comp at the moment.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, just on that, the Richmond forward pressure was probably a lot greater than the West Coast forward pressure. So, a lot of those errors in the Richmond game probably come from that perceived pressure of a Richmond side that is a lot better at that forward pressure game. A couple of things that really stood out to me that I continue to like is just that Langford remains an absolute weapon up forward. It's, he did actually miss a couple of shots that I thought he would have kicked normally, but how good is it to have someone who can, take a mark on 50 and then wheel around, taking advantage of the newsstand rule and just pop it through, and you're pretty confident when they do that. There's a few players like that at the moment. So obviously Stringer, and then Perkins has also shown that he can do it. And then speaking of Stringer, what I've really pleased about him, and it's been highlighted a few times, but the selfless roles that he's been playing this year, he hasn't always had to be the man and the one kicking goals. I think with Setterfield out, he's really stepped up as that big bullocking midfielder in the centre bounces. And, he hasn't necessarily been having, statistically outstanding games there, but what he's doing is creating space for the younger midfielders that have been running through there, like Hobbs and Caldwell, to actually get some space and get some clearances there. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for the role that he's been playing, even though it's not always showing for him on the stat sheet.
It's interesting because he's playing a very similar role to what he did in 2021, which is this guy that started out at centre bounces and charged forward. But his roles changed, like you said, keeping that. He's sort of having to perform a much more selfless role around the midfield a bit more often. So he's not as far forward as he normally is, because he's basically playing as this half forward that pushes up to provide physical presence around a clearance and then push forward again. And, historically, he hasn't always been fit enough to play that, but he's been, back for 5-6 weeks now. He's probably built the match fitness in to get to that point. And whilst he's not the forward presence he's been lately, so and when I say lately, I mean last few years, it's certainly with Setterfield out a role we need, because even Hobbs and Caldwell, as much as they've shown they're willing to mix it physically, they're still not big, and they're not the guys that can take body. It'll be Cripps in a couple of weeks, but those sorts of guys out of stoppage. And Cripps has shown, we're not getting too deep into the Carlton podcast, but Cripps has shown if you put someone that's talented next to him, he's not always going to be able to stop them defensively. But on Langford, it's interesting because there's plenty of posters on this board. Bont and I have had this discussion multiple times on the podcast that are pulling the hairs out, going, he should have been forward this whole time. What are we doing? He's always been probably our best set shot, and he missed a few on the weekend, but I think he's on 20 goals for the year. Well, 19, 20 goals for the year, which would be our leading goal kicker. And considering he started the first, fortnight as a defender, it's a pretty good effort. And it's someone with his skill set forward, I think, just gives us so much more flexibility to play a Durham and a Martin on a wing and really suit their strengths as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's our leading goal kicker. It's interesting because I agree with you in that Stringer hasn't actually been as forward prominently as probably in the past for us, but he's still our second leading goal scorer on 16. So it's but I mean, you look at that, I think he kicked 4 goals 6 or something ridiculous like that against GWS, and he might have bagged 4 in another game. So he's had those couple of games where he's probably been that offensive weapon because we've left him close to goal, but it has been good, I think. And the other thing I like about Stringer is that, as you guys have touched on, is he doesn't necessarily need to have the ball in hand to be influential now. When he did that period towards the back end of 2021, it was when he was getting that, 25 touches a game. And that's when he was sort of that dominant best player in the comp type style player. And he's not the best player in the comp at the moment, obviously, but he's still able to throw his body in there. And it just certainly makes it a lot better, I think, as you guys said, for the rest of the midfielders to have someone big like him to stand up. And the only problem is, obviously, now he's 28, 29 years old, so you've got to find someone to replace him sooner rather than later. And good luck finding another Jake Stringer type to pick up as cheaply as we did from the Bulldogs when we got him.
We'll wrap up our match review just in a sec, but before we do, there's probably not too many negatives we can take out of a 50-point win, but I might start with you here, Bont. Was there anything out of the game that concerned you or that you weren't totally happy with coming into this week's game against North Melbourne?
It's interesting because there was a couple of things that I didn't like on the night. Zerk Thatcher's performance was one of them. I thought he was pretty average on the night. I thought he got outplayed, but watching the replay back, it's interesting to see the 4 goals that Oscar Allen kicked. The last one, obviously, Heppel just he was never going to outmark Allen, so I reckon he just went, I'm going to make you earn this one. So, you can't really count that against Zerk. The Joe the Goose, which was his second goal again, I watching the replay, it's funny because Zerk's probably 20 metres in front of him running back towards goal. And Allen's just sort of jogging, and he sort of realised that Zerk was going to be 3-on-1. And all of a sudden, Allen goes, I'll sprint here. He's done the classic forward sprint back towards goal, which, again, you count that against Zerk, it's pretty hard to. And even his first goal, the first goal he sort of kicked, he got this brilliant 20-metre bull or 30-metre bullet that Robert Harvey would have been proud of. It was interesting because Ridley was probably about half a metre off the trajectory, and he didn't have enough time to get across to put a fist in. So you sort of look at that and you go, well, Allen's kicked 4. He did probably towel Zerk up a little bit. Was it as bad as it seemed on the night? I don't think it was. There was quite a few of us who in the game day thread who weren't happy with it, but I didn't like his game at the time. But upon reflection, it's probably was a good learning curve for him a little bit. But the one thing I didn't really like, and it wasn't actually an Essendon thing, it was Tom Barras. Now, when we got we got out in the open, and Merritt kicked it long to Guelphy, and then Guelphy tapped it to Draper, and Draper handballed it to Langford for our own Joe the Goose goal. One of the things I didn't like was Guelphy's dive to tap it, and as soon as he's gone to ground, Barras has come in with the shoulder. He's dived sort of into, and he's pretty lucky that Guelphy sort of saw him coming, because Guelphy saw him coming and sort of held himself back. And if Guelphy hadn't really seen him coming, he probably would have just dived straight in and taken him head high and run straight through him. And it's a pretty cheap shot to take on the footy field. And you can't, I know there's no way the AFL can sort of rule this, because you can't pick a bloke out and say, oh, well, if you'd hit him, I know there's the potential for injury. They ping now with these sling tackles, but this one's sort of a different class. But at the same time, it's just not what you really want to see in the game. I don't think, the bloke's on the ground, he's tapped the ball on, you're not going to get to the contest. There's no need to try and clean him up. It's a pretty cheap shot, and I was pretty surprised to see it coming from a bloke like Tom Barras, who, from what I can tell, is usually a pretty clean player.
It's interesting. I didn't notice it on the night. You mentioned it when we were discussing the pod sort of beforehand, and I couldn't recall, so I had to go back and watch it. And I think it's just one of those things when you're sick of your team getting pumped by 100 points every week that you just do sort of stupid stuff like that. You're right. He probably is lucky that Guelphy saw him coming, because the last thing West Coast need with their injury list is Barras missing with a suspension. Could you imagine Adam Simpson's response to that? But I'll move back to what you said about Zerk. I tend to think that Oscar Allen was the worst matchup for him in terms of the style of player. So Zerk isn't a powerful athlete. He's more of a rangy type of guy. He's deceptively quick in the lead, but he's not going to catch guys over the first 20 meters. And Oscar Allen is exactly that. And so I think it was probably a poor matchup. I think the coaching staff didn't move fast enough or at all. I think in putting Laverty on him, I think that would have been a much more natural matchup for Allen. But yeah, you're right. It will be a learning curve, I think, for Zerk. We'll get Kip's view on that in a second. But for me, the big negative out of the weekend was sort of our key position forward output. And we'll touch on Nick Bryan in a minute, so I won't go too deeply into that at this stage. But just basically 0 goals, 2 out of Bryan and Wiedemann. I think Draper kicked 1 goal, 1. So you're batting at 1 goal, 3 between your 3 tools, or the 3 guys rotating through his tools through your forward line. It's, we've been able to cover, injuries in the midfield, injuries in defence, but the one sort of issue to highlight for me this year has been sort of a really inconsistent output from our key position forwards. Phillips had 1 good game against Melbourne and disappeared, but Peter Wright can't get back quick enough, I don't think.
Yeah. I'm not overly concerned. Wiedemann's had a few good weeks. Obviously, he didn't probably perform at the same level against West Coast. So you just take 1 game after 4 or 5 good ones. I'm not overly concerned about that. And then, despite the fact we haven't had dominant key position forwards this year, we're still 6 for points 4. And as you mentioned, we're missing our number 1 in Wright. I think we'll probably get to it, but they've just in the last couple of hours tried to rectify that forward depth issue through the mid-season draft. But when we're still scoring as effectively as we are without Peter Wright, without, huge output for key forwards, then I'm not overly concerned. I mean, you just have to look at the second time I brought it up, even though it's not the week for it, but look at Carlton. They've got Curnow and ostensibly Harry Mackay, and they're struggling. So I'd much rather be in our shoes than their shoes at the moment.
Good point. Was there anything before we move on to take it or leave it, Kip, that you want to raise that concerned you out of the game?
Look, it's again something's been said, but the commentary that was arse.
Oh, that was horrendous. Oh boy.
You didn't think it was too bad in the game day thread though, Grizz? Is that right? Yeah.
Not too bad, but then again, I watched it back, and maybe it was because people talked about how bad it was, had an effect on it. But when I watch the game, I get really engrossed in it. I don't really pay attention to the commentary. Back when you're relaxed because you know what the score is, yeah, it wasn't great. But I wonder how much of it was, like I said, it wasn't a great game for the neutral observer. How much it just them trying to generate interest, but yeah, you would have thought West Coast were 5 points down for the entirety of the game at that point, or that it was some tactical masterstroke by Adam Simpson by playing man on man, which was the funniest thing.
I'm not sure how across the NRL you are, but a few years ago when the Storm and Panthers played in that grand final, and Phil Gould, the Storm were flogging the Panthers, and Phil Gould was all about how good the Panthers were playing.
They're a chance at half. Their coming was no. He said they were on top at half time, and I think they were 3 tries down, which was just unbelievable.
It was a bit like Ben Dixon saying that West Coast were in Essendon's head, and Essendon had just gone 5 goals up or something like that.
Yeah,
I made one of my rare ventures onto Twitter that time, Kip, when Phil Gould did that to give Phil Gould a spray, and I'm now blocked by Phil on Twitter. So
he's he's the Damien Barrett of the NRL world when it comes to blocking people on Twitter. But
someone else that's blocked me on Twitter, but
like I'm a big NRL fan. I don't follow the Storm. I follow a Sydney-based team, but not Penrith. And even I was like, oh, Phil, come on, mate. Easy on. We'll move now. We'll wrap up this week and sort of the on-field issues with a game I like to play called Take It or Leave It, which is when Kit, Bonter, and I will both make a statement, and the other two have to tell them whether they are going to take it or leave it, or agree with it and disagree with it. Kip, as our special guest, I'll give you the new ball. What is your take it or leave it?
All right, Bonser and Grizz, take it or leave it. Nick Bryan should seriously consider whether his future is at Essendon.
I agree with it, but I think the problem is for me is I actually like Nick Bryan. So I actually didn't think he's copped a bit of heat for his game on Saturday night, and I haven't, and I said on the board today, and I actually was going to do it, but I haven't looked at it. At the time when he got subbed off, statistically, he actually wasn't that far behind Draper. So, I know Draper does these little flashy things every now and then, like the outside of the boot point that he kicked against Richmond, or he might have even done on Saturday night when he did it. But, he does these flashy things that people remember. But I think I've said to you before, Grizz, that I think his flash is a little bit more than what his substance is, and people get sucked into it. Whereas, Bryan doesn't really have that sort of flashy aspect to him. He had some great tap outs on Saturday night. There was one there, he tapped straight down the throat of Perkins. Unfortunately, Perkins got tackled about a step after he hit it straight down his throat. But, it was that sort of play that I was like, geez, if Perkins had actually got through that tackle and got the clearance, everyone would be raving about it because it'd be the future that we're seeing. So I think if he gets dropped again, he should absolutely be looking somewhere else, because I just don't think we're going to, if we're not playing him now, then we're probably never going to play him, especially against North Melbourne, because, there was a bit of this debate today about whether you play him or Phillips. We've got to play Phillips because we're trying to win. We're playing North Melbourne. Let's be honest. If the difference between us winning and losing is Bryan and Phillips, we're in a lot bigger trouble than we probably realise. So I think if he gets dropped and can't stay in the side based on what he showed on Saturday night, then absolutely he needs to start looking elsewhere, because we're clearly just not gonna use him as the second option to Sam Draper.
Yeah, I'll take it in the sense that I think he will, not that I want him to or think he should, or that I think that I want him to or I would like him to. I'll push back just from what Bob said about, them not really statistically being a difference between Draper and Bryan when he went off. Draper had, I think, 3 or 4 contested marks for the game. I don't think Bryan had one, or if he did, I missed it. So that's why I think Bryan at the moment is behind Draper. Draper's just physically more developed. But I just think I've had this opinion for a while that we're not going to get the best out of both of them in the same team. For them both to be the best player the players are going to be, it's probably going to be as number one rucks on different teams. Because I don't think either of them have the forward craft to be, 30% forward, 70% forward, 30% ruck. And that's what the good ruck combinations are. You look at Gawn and Grundy at Melbourne. Gawn's about 30 to 40% ruck, forward at the moment. So you're not going to get 50-50 genuine ruck combinations anymore. And I think Draper's probably just more entrenched as a senior ruckman. And the reality is, it's how the AFL works nowadays. You know, you draft a ruckman, you develop him, and then he gets picked off at about year 4 or 5 because another team can offer them first team opportunities. And it's just how it's worked. Now, historically, you look at the last 25 years, we've sort of drafted our own ruckman. You go, you know, Barnes to your left, then came back again. Then Alessio, Hill, Bell Chambers, Ryder, now Draper and Bryan. We tend to pick and develop our own ruckman, so I don't think we would be fearful of letting him go. But, you know, I would suspect that if he doesn't play the majority of games of the rest of the year, he will look to leave. But if he doesn't play the rest of the year, you know, what sort of market is there going to be for him? I don't know. But he'll certainly, I think Gold Coast were interested this time last year or 2 years ago, and they were pretty heavily into him. So there'll be suitors because he's dominating the BFL.
His other suitor actually was also St Kilda. They offered him a 4-year deal, and that would have been, or was that Draper?
That was Draper.
That was Draper, which would have been disaster for St Kilda because Marshall and Draper would have the same problems that you've just alluded to with Bryan and Draper.
Yeah, I think Marshall's probably a better forward than both Bryan and Draper. I think he has shown more forward craft, but he's generally better at a number one ruck. Yeah. I'll take the second ball, or the second over, if you will, to use cricketing parlance. Take it or leave it, guys. A tipper timeout is required.
I'm going to leave that for the moment. Yes, he's not playing at the level that he has in the past. But if you look at the way we've structured up, we've gone with 3 small forwards recently. So if you look at the West Coast game, we had Menzies, Tipper and Guelphy, and then also had Snelling there playing as a, you know, running through the midfield a bit, but also in that forward line. So if you're wanting to keep that structure, you're picking either Wanganeen or Davey, neither of which I think will be an upgrade at this stage. I know Davey's done some nice things, but he's really in and out of games. We're not getting as much out of Tipper as we want, but I think we give him time to persist at least till the bye to give him an opportunity to work his way into form.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with that and say absolutely. I agree that the Tipper rest is needed against Richmond. He didn't hit the scoreboard against Richmond, and disposals wise, I suppose you could argue again against Richmond he wasn't great, but he did have a lot of defensive pressure, and I think he laid a fair number of tackles. But Saturday night he just looked like the mind knew what he wanted to do, but the body just isn't quite able to do it. And I don't know how he goes about changing that. We do know that, you know, once some players sort of hit that 30-year-old, the cliff comes very quickly, and he has only just recently turned 30, only a couple of weeks ago or a few weeks ago now. So maybe the cliff is starting to come, but yeah, I just thought on Saturday night the body just did not look like it could keep up with what his mind wanted to do, and you know that drop shot on goal when he could have in the past would just nailed that on his left was a little bit disappointing to see. But I mean, at the same time, if he keeps going, because as you said, Kip, Davey and Wanganeen aren't necessarily the best to see. So, you know, we can keep him. But yeah, I'd take that. And my take it or leave it is that, you know, Nick Hind is a shadow of his former self. And at the moment, he's probably lucky to be in the best 22 if we're looking to develop someone like a Massimo D'Ambrosio off the half-back flank. We'd be better put the time into him rather than to persist with Hind.
Yeah, I think there's probably two take it or leave it there. I'll address the primary one, which is Nick Hind is a shadow of his former self. I think he's certainly not the form he was in 2021 when he first crossed over. I think part of that is role, though. I think in 2021, the whole team had this license to just attack, freewheel, go for it. We'll worry about defense later. And that sort of really played to his strengths. I think he's playing a role where he's meant to be a bit more accountable. I've been quite vocal during game day threads. So I think some of his decisions, I suppose, under pressure have been really poor. When he's in tight, he can make some really poor decisions with the ball. But in any sense, I don't think he's a shadow of his former self, but I think he's certainly blunted. But I would suspect that's more Scott requiring a more accountable role of his defenders.
Yeah, I agree. I think also the move of McGrath back also takes away some of the need for him to play that, you know, attacking role. So in 2021, obviously, he was replacing Sard and McKenna in that role, and he's sort of fulfilling both roles. I don't think Redmond quite had as good a season in 21 as he has the last couple of seasons, so he was picking up a lot more of the slack there. I agree with a lot what you said there, Grizz. I'm in the same boat as you.
Well, we'll move on to off-field happenings of this week, and we'll quickly run through that before we get to a preview of the North game. The first is the mid-season draft happened roughly an hour and a half ago from the recording of this podcast. Essendon drafted a young man by the name of Jaden Hunter from the Perth Football Club, 196 centimetre, 93 kilo key forward. He's kicked 23 goals this year, 11 in his first 3 games, 12, in his first 3 games at reserves level, coming off an ACL, and 11 in the 3 games in the seniors since then. I think he kicked 5 on the weekend when Dodora's watching him, so I suppose there's nothing like timing your run. But interesting pickup, because we tend to go the smaller types that can contribute straight away. Your Menzies, D'Ambrosios, Durhams, Snellings in the preseason mid-season draft. But do you guys know much about Jaden Hunter? What's your thoughts on picking a developmental key forward, really?
Do we play him this week because their key position forwards have been struggling, as you said, Chris? I mean, the reality is I don't know anything about him. And so, yeah, I mean, our key position forwards are obviously a problem. It's interesting, though, because now it almost feels now like we've got too many on the list. And it's weird because, and the reason for that is obviously because Harrison Jones and Peter Wright have been injured. And obviously, I just don't see a side where Wright, Wiedemann, and Jones all play together. And then obviously now I don't see a way where the new guy fits in as a 4th tall forward in our AFL side, but obviously you need your depth. So that's probably where he's going to slide in. It might make Harrison Jones feel a little bit uneasy, but I don't think he'll be looking over his shoulder just yet.
Look, I agree. I'm the same as you. I've got no idea. I couldn't pick him out of a lineup. But again, it's an area that we've got a few question marks. You know, Wright's probably the only lock that you've got in that role. Wiedemann's showing nice signs, but again, you know, history suggests that he can't maintain that. Jones, obviously, with his injuries, and then Baldwin seems to have moved back, and Voss, you know, after a strong start in the VFL, start to struggle, or that's partly due to the VFL struggles as well. I'm interested to note that he's only gone for a 6-month contract. So if it's not working out, it's pretty easy to get off the list. But look, you know, Ed Pascoe's given him the certificate of approval, and I think that's good enough for me.
Yeah, well, if Ed Pascoe or EDPS, as he's known on the Essendon board, is okay with it, then I'm with Kit. No arguments here. I will defer to that expertise. Just profile in the Essendon Football Club, athletic player, 196 centimetres tall, competitive in the air, versatile, can play forward or back. Throw out the stumps, really.
Can play forward or back. Classic Essendon.
Great. They're never gonna say, oh yeah, look, 196 centimetres, not very athletic. We can kick a snag. Owing one dimensional, they're always going to say that sort of stuff. And the other thing we'll just briefly touch on is the injury list. So some good news. Elijah Sartis, a man who apparently is being written off at different points in this board, already is due to return to the VFL this week, which is probably earlier than expected. Nick Cox obviously got through unscathed. Dylan Shield, Jake Kelly expected to be back for selection this week. The injury list is getting shorter, not longer, which is probably the first time we can say that in 12 weeks, which is good to see. Yeah, any thoughts on, did either of you watch Nick Cox's game this weekend, or any thoughts on Elijah Sartis?
I didn't see his game, but I know they played him back, which is, I think you and I have been pretty vocal in the past, Chris, that we want him to go back because, or go forward. Just pick one spot, don't leave him on the wing. So if they're going to play him back, that's great. But yeah, knowing Essendon, we may very well end up throwing him forward at some point too, just because we like to have these players that can play either end of the ground for unknown reasons. We just can't seem to settle him at one end. So good to see him back. Sardis, another one, good to be back. Just on the injuries list, interesting. It was only because I had this discussion on the North board. They were amazed when I said that Peter Wright may come back. If he doesn't come back, next week against Carlton, when we have the bye, does he play VFL just to get some touch?
Oh, I don't know. It'll be dependent on when he's fit. If he's fit when the bye's on and the VFL's playing, I don't think that there's anything to lose by running him out for a half or so, is there?
I can just imagine how our board will react if he aggravates that shoulder in a VFL.
Pings a hamstring.
Oh, God.
Do the Zach Reed. Yeah. Just back on Cox. I'm actually a wing believer. I think he could be something special there.
Oh, you're not welcome on this podcast.
No, I don't think I'll be getting an invite back. But I think back's a good way to get him in, and I think that's where Brad Scott sees him playing his best football. And I think he's way back in the side, barring significant injuries, is through the role Dyson Hebble's playing. As that sort of seventh defender, filling a lot of roles and not having heaps of responsibility in a defensive sense, if you get what I'm saying, as a way of getting him in there. But that's probably going to be dependent on Hebble's form, and Hebble's form's been really good. So, if he has to work to get back in the side and demonstrate some really good form, then that's going to be really good for us going forward.
Chris, get a load of this guy. Not only is he putting Cox in the wing, he's going to shoot our favourite halfback flanker in Heppel. What is going on?
Oh, mate. Sorry, I've got to screen these guys more closely, clearly. We'll get into the preview of the North game this week. It's grand final week, or at least for half of this game, at least.
Well, lucky for them, they get 2 grand finals this year.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they haven't been. They probably had sort of less success than we have, which is something to say over the last 20 years. But yeah, so it's grand final week for North Melbourne this week. It's round 12 for us. So yippee, I suppose. North Melbourne not in as bad a form as you'd think. They basically lost against Sydney because they couldn't count, and then were reasonably effective against Collingwood last week. I suppose, what are you guys expecting from this week? Where do you think it'll be won and lost? Kit, we might start with you.
I see this game playing out a lot like last year's did. So last year, North were dominant at clearance, and North are actually the best stoppage clearance differential side in the competition at the moment. They've actually just jumped ahead of Brisbane, who were, when we actually played them, Brisbane were the top side in that. So I think North are going to do quite well in the clearances, especially with Essendon missing Setterfield and Parrish at the very least. Hopefully Shield does come back in. Where I think it'll be won, and like it was won last year, is through Essendon's halfbacks and interceptors. So last year, North would win it out of the clearance, they'd kick it forward, and our players would be able to intercept, and they would get them on turnover. We'd score through that because they just weren't set up well enough to stop us. And that's how I sort of see the game playing out again this year. All things being equal, that's where I see Essendon's chance of winning being really high. If we match them in the clearance, then I don't think they've got any chance.
Yeah, this is another game. I think people will say that this is a classic Essendon to lose. But as you said, Kip, last year we put them to the sword, and I don't think much has changed really. Yeah, North are in a fair bit of strife. Depending on when Clarko comes back, came out today. He's not coming back. I thought he might come back this week just to try and get another win over us, because he does enjoy beating us as he did multiple times at Hawthorn. But yeah, it's hard to see where North win this outside of the clearances. If they don't absolutely dominate clearances, then they're probably going to struggle. Their back six don't provide a hell of a lot of run, especially Aaron Hall, Jack Zeeble back there. They're not exactly lightning quick athletic players. They do get a lot of the ball, but there's just not much movement. Their forward line is a one-man show in Nick Larkey, but I think we could probably cover him relatively okay. I think Zerk will bounce back and have a crack there. So yeah, I'm sort of with you, Kip. As long as we don't get completely obliterated in clearances, I think we should be okay.
I tend to think this is much like the West Coast game in that this is historically the game we lose. I'm growing faith in Scott and his team that he seems to have drilled a way to win these games. We've beaten Hawthorn, GWS, and obviously West Coast last week, all in pretty comprehensive fashions. West Coast, the GWS score was close, but that's because we couldn't hit the fat side of a barn that week. So I think we'll win. It's interesting watching that North Melbourne team. The defence is a shambles at the moment. Ben Mackay's defending like a caravan at the moment, being towed around and not doing much else. So and Griffin Logue hasn't been much chop as a recruit either. So it'll be interesting to see if Wiedemann and Stringer can hopefully have bigger games this week as forwards in terms of goal kicking. But the game will be won on turnover. If we can capitalise on theirs and limit ours, I think I'm just sort of reiterating everything we've just said. I think we'll win. I don't think they've got the class on the outside that we do. And as great as stoppage is, 70% of score in AFL comes from turnover. So you can't rely purely on stoppage. And I think provided we can control the turnover game and Redmond and Ridley can play the games they've been doing recently, I think we'll win this. And Zerk Thatcher kept Larkey basically in his back pocket last year. Like he was absolutely teared up by Zerk. So it's probably a good matchup for Zerk to get his confidence back.
It's also interesting. I don't know this because I actually watched the highlights of the game, but last year we got 2 goals out of Harry Jones, we got 3 goals out of James Stewart, we got 2 goals out of Peter Wright, and none of those guys are actually going to end up playing this game. So it is sort of contrasting how our forward line has looked this year to last year. And the other interesting thing about last year's game against North was Shield and Parrish didn't actually play that game either. So they weren't there last year, and which is obviously why we were getting beaten in the clearances, and we still managed to beat them by 48 points. So yeah,
and North won't have Luke Davies-Uniacke, who was a big reason why they were dominant in stoppage in that game last year as well. So sort of evens out there.
Big game for McGrath on Harry Sheasel. Anything good that happens for North Melbourne at the moment tends to go through George Wardlaw or Harry Sheasel. So I think if Andy McGrath can lock him down across half forward, because he's been playing forward a bit more, I think we'll be able to stifle their creativity a lot more than we sort of were able to, I think, last year from the stoppages. And I really like look at Wardlaw, but hopefully him and Hobbs can have a good head-to-head. That'd be nice. So tips and margin, guys. We're all tipping Essendon by the sound of it. What are the margins we're going with, and what's your crazy prediction for this week? Mine last week was that Redmond was going to kick 3. He kicked one in the opening 2 minutes, handed one off in the 4th. I was dirty. I was not happy. But they'll teach a defender for passing it off. So what's the margins and crazy prediction for this week?
Oh, look, I'll say Essendon will win by 10 goals. We'll say 10 goals because it's probably about what we should have been the Eagles by, and I'm not too sure North are much better. I'm not convinced North are trying to win too many games, to be honest. And I still find it very hard to believe that they couldn't count properly. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. Crazy predictions. Let's say Wiedemann will kick 7. I've said on the board that he needs to maybe have a bit of goalkeeping practice, because the last 3 weeks he's been pretty iffy in front of goals. Over his career he's been pretty good, but the last 3 weeks he's been pretty bad. So yeah, I'll say Wiedemann will kick 7 straight, and yeah, we'll beat him by 10 goals.
I'm not as confident in terms of the margin. I think probably more in the 5-6 goal range. And my crazy prediction is that Jordan Ridley will break the intercept mark record that Darcy Moore had for a brief moment until Champion Data snatched it away.
That'd be like 22 intercept marks or something, wouldn't it? Like something.
I think it's only 10 intercept marks. It's not intercept possessions.
I'm thinking total marks. I think total marks is 22. Yeah, intercepts is 11. Well, he might be on for 11. That might well be the case. I'm tipping Essendon by 24 points. I think it's going to be a 4-goal margin. I think they're going to be up for this week because it's us. So we can't sort of underrate that. I think my crazy prediction, I think Zach will have 45 plus disposals. I think they're not going to be able to go with him on the outside. I don't know if that's too crazy. He's never had 45 before, so I suppose that's the craziness of it. Not many people have. So
I wonder if with Zach we can put in a retrospective way to get his suspension from a few weeks back cancelled, so he can be Brownlow eligible again after Chera got off somehow.
I think we just need to hire whoever Carlton's lawyer is. Like that guy he's had more wins than Carlton had this year. But he's doing a good job. All right, well that will wrap us up for this week. Kip, thanks again for jumping on. It's a pleasure to have you as always.
No, thanks. Great to be back and chat with you blokes. And yeah, hopefully, our predictions aren't showing up to be too optimistic after Sunday afternoon.
Bonta, thanks again for jumping on. Good to see you again this week.
Pleasure as always, mate.
All right, well, that'll wrap us up for this week. Thanks for listening to the Bombercast Round 12 edition. Make sure that you like, subscribe, and tell your Essendon supporting mates. Good luck this week. Go Bombers.